Hi class, it's Bill Berry, picking up with the second video in our series on data and data types and conversions. In the first video we gave some background information and reviewed what we know about syntax descriptions, added some new things to our knowledge, and now we're going to pick up with the second piece, which is actually working with data. So let's jump down there. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do is sort of get a lay of the land. We're going to give you a few background operations and we're going to jump right into our add, edit, and delete. So here are some things that you just need to know about. If you ever needed to copy a table for any reason, there's some syntax here that can do that. You can say create table and then give it the new name, the new table's name, and then you can say as and then select star from and then give an existing table. Now that is not going to copy all of its, I guess I would call it schema entanglements, right? It's not going to copy all of the foreign key relationships and all of that. It's just going to sort of copy the main part of the, the definitions. So the column definitions, but no constraints as we'll learn the name later. You can also get rid of tables, right? You can say drop table and you can drop that table by giving it its name. Just remember that drops the entire table. That table and all the definition and all its data is just gone. So there's no undo on that. If you say drop table and you're the database administrator, poof, there it goes and it's not coming back. So just realize that you have the power to destroy that data. If you make that mistake, you can certainly go back and get your sample data. If that's what's the case, you can go reinstall your sample database stuff and that's fine. If you're at work, not so easy, but the good news is they're not going to give you permission to do that stuff when you first start. So you will be unlikely to have that kind of power when you start working in a particular group that uses a database. The other thing you can do is, remember, this drops the table and its the existing table definition and the data, but if you wanted to, you can also just say truncate. That gets rid of the data, but not the definition, not the schema. So this will delete, you could have a million rows in a table, you say truncate and then give the name of the table, then now you have 0 rows. But the table still exists, right? So that's the difference between drop and truncate. So there we go, just some quick operations that you might know about. Alright, the first thing we're going to do is talk about insert. When we want to add data to a table, how do we do that, right? And the keyword here, the command, is going to be the insert command. What does that look like? Well, we're going to say the word insert and then we're going to give the table name. Optionally, you can say into, but it doesn't change the picture any. Optionally, you can give it a column list, and we're going to practice with and without the column list. And then, here's the important part, you have to say values, and then in required parentheses, you give the data that's going to go in each of those spots, right? So for each column, what data do you want? So there's a couple of little nuances here that we want to understand. While this is optional, right, you don't have to include the column list, but if you do, you have to make sure that your data here matches the order of your column list here. So you can get creative with what order things go in by listing them in a different order in the column list, but you must follow suit. You must use the same ordering for that in your expressions down here. The other thing is, if you decide you don't want to have the column list, right, you don't want to use that, that's fine. Then you just follow the order that it is in the table, right? So that's another useful thing. So another thing that we need to learn is there's some keywords that are kind of useful here. One is the word default. If SQL will automatically know what to do with something, then you can just say the word default. And automatically means, for instance, if you have set up your definition such that that particular column is an auto increment column, which we'll study more about later, which that means SQL can automatically generate data for it, right? So we do that often because we're just generating keys 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't really care what data it is. It just needs to be the next one, right? That's called auto increment. So if you say default, SQL will go, oh, okay, I'll just put the next thing, right? I'll just put in whatever's the next thing. Also, sometimes you have defaults for a particular column. For instance, customer balance defaults to $0. So if that's the case, you can say default and SQL will go, oh, I know what to do here. I'm just going to put the 0. The other thing is sometimes you want to skip, right? If you want to skip that data, sometimes you have to use the word null because of the way that you've decided to list the columns. You can say null to say, hey, I'm not putting any data in this cell. I'm just leaving it null. That is only possible if your column definition is marked not null. So those are two interesting keywords that you want to know about. So let us now use this insert syntax and let's see if we can go do one with our sample little database. Right, so here we have our pet adoption database. You may have seen this in other videos. Here's the EER for it, simple thing. Here's our customer sample data, some pet sample data, customer pet, linking table data. So what if we want to do an exercise with that? Let's see what we need to do. In fact, let's think a little bit first about what do we need to do first. If we were going to try to fill in all of this data, which ones do we have to do first? Because there is an order. Well, I would suggest to you that you need to follow this order. First customer, then pet, then customer pet. Now, you could switch those first two. You could do pet and then customer, but this one always has to be done last. Why? Because this has foreign keys. Right? These are foreign keys that need to rely on existing data in pet and customer. If you don't already have these key values present, how are you going to add data that has a proper tie-in to one of those primary key values? So this one, in our case, must be done last. Pick the order you want of these, but you got to do the linking table data last, right? Hopefully you understand that, what makes sense with that. Okay, so let's do an example. Here's our syntax up here. So let us now, let me bring up Notepad, Notepad. Okay, so let us bring up Notepad and see if we can write a valid insert command. And we want to use the syntax that uses the column names, right? So we're going to do using column names. So we know we need to have insert, right? Then optionally we have into and the table name. Well, let's see. Customer is the name of the table. So I can say insert customer, or I can say insert into customer. Doesn't matter. Either one of those is fine. Right? We'll go with that. Now this says we want to use the column names. So what columns do we need to fill in? Well, we might be able to do it a couple different ways. Let's put all the column names, but maybe we'll put them in a funny order. So I'm going to give it the column names, but let's just say maybe I put in the customer ID first, and then maybe I put in the customer name, but maybe I put the balance first and then the phone. I don't know, right? When we specify the list of columns, we can actually have some control over the order of the data. Right? Now what comes next? We have to say values, right? Because now we've told it what columns we're filling in which order, but we've got to tell it what values. And again here, this goes in parentheses, right? So notice that's consistent between these two. And we want to add the customer above. So what is the customer ID? Well, we have some options. We could say the word default, right? That just says, hey, if we know this is auto increment, go for it. Just pick the next number, right? Since we know we're starting from scratch, maybe we know there's nothing in here, we can also put 1. 1 is also useful because then we know for sure that Judd Jetson is customer 1, right? Whereas if we say default, we're not quite sure what it's going to do. If it's empty, of course it's going to do 1, but if we look back at the data, we'll see certainly that Judd is number 1 and we won't have to go think about it. What's next? Customer name must be next, so I'm going to do Judd Jetson. Then the balance must be next, right? We listed it third here, so we've got to list it third here. 45, and then the customer phone, 206-888, right? So there is our, now that's probably a text column, right? Since it's a phone number. Then we put a semicolon and we're done. Right? So that's how we construct an insert command, and we're using here the column numbers. Or the column name, sorry. Now if we had decided not to provide the customer ID, great. We could do that, and then we just make sure that that matches, right? Now, if we knew more, right? If we knew more, maybe we could shorten it even more. For instance, if the customer balance defaults to 0 and it happened to be that Judd had a 0 balance, maybe we could put default here, right? But as far as we know, that's a pretty good set, right? So that's how you make the insert work. That would be inserting one customer at a time. And we'll do some other examples too. Each one of these, of course, when we're in class, we'll have examples following. All right, so there's an example of one complete wording here. In this case, I use the customer ID, put it last, and I use the word default. Great, you can certainly do that. You can also do this. Again, these are some sample ways you could accomplish the task based on the stuff we just talked about. So that's great. Okay, next is, let's say we wanted to add the second customer, but we don't want to use the column names, right? So in this case, I don't want a list of column names. So if I don't supply that and I want to add the second customer, how do I do it? Well, remember now that without the list of column names, we're stuck following the database order. So we can look up here at the EER and see that we've got to follow this order. Again, I could put to, or I could say default, right? So maybe I say default, maybe I'm going to say to this time just for fun. Then I have to put the name, Harriet Hanson. Then comes the customer phone number. Right? Again, that's probably, we see up there, it actually is a character field, so we would probably want to do that. And then the balance is 0. Again, I can say 0 if I'd like. I could just say 0. Or if I knew that the definition allowed defaulting, which you can't see in an EER, you could actually say the word 0.0, right? Or say default, and then it would insert the 0. So as far as we know, that is now a pretty good implementation of not using the column list, but still supplying all the data in the order now in which it appears in the table, right? So that's the way that you could do that. So here's some sample output. Here's one. Here's another. Again, we've already talked through that, so pause it if you want to observe and pay attention for a second and see if you understand everything. Okay, last but not least, let us use the syntax that you could add all the pets with one single statement, right, with no column names. So now I'm going to insert pet, and I know that I can put values here, right? So I know that Fluffy comes first. I'm going to put pet ID 1. Again, if I know the table's empty, it's sort of nice because then I know Fluffy is pet number 1. When I go to insert the linking table data later, then that'll be useful to know, right? Then comes the pet name, Fluffy. Then comes the adoption date, 2017. Make sure we use the correct syntax, right? Now the cool thing here is, notice there is a way to put a comma. Let's see, does this actually, this syntax description doesn't really show this, right? Not very well. You can put now a comma and do more. Right, so I'm going to actually copy this line and paste it twice. Just remember the last one can't have a comma, it has to have the semicolon. So now pet number 2 is Fluffy, or pet number 2, sorry, is Lucky. And when was Lucky adopted? All right, 07. And then last pet is named Duke. And Duke was adopted when? 10/31. Great. So that's the syntax if we wanted to do one where we are inserting multiple rows in a single insert statement, and now without the column names in this case. Again, you can use the column names. If you do, follow the order when you're doing this. So that's an example of how you can do inserts in various ways, with column names, without column names, many rows at once. It's a lot easier to put a whole bunch of rows in this way than it is to do separate insert statements, right? That gets kind of annoying. So this is a great way when you have lots of data. So here's an example of how you could do it. Or again, you could use default if you know that it's an auto increment, or you could use the numbers if you want to have easier reference when you go to do the linking table data later. So there you go. So that's the basics of using the insert command. Now I do want to show you one variation before we pause and sort of switch videos here. So one other note that we'll have here is that you can also add data from one table into another table. So a variation of the insert command says insert into this table, and then you can just write a select statement that will gather the data from the other table. So for instance, insert into the invoice archive, and the way that you get it is you select star from the invoices table. Right? And of course you can have a where clause. So this goes and gets all the invoices that are settled, there's no money owing on them, and it puts them into the invoice archive table. Maybe it then would go and delete them, right? Potentially you could go and have a separate command that would delete them because they're already now archived. So that's the general idea here behind how you insert data into a table. So stop and pause if you'd like, go back and reread those, rewatch the video if you want to recover it, but otherwise we're going to say that's good in terms of inserting data. We're going to move now to another video where we're going to be talking about the other two operations, which is how do I edit data and how do I remove data from an existing table. So let's pause the video here. Thanks for watching this one, and we will pick up in the next.